Hello again, 201. In this video, I'm going to see how much of the first three questions of Chapter 11, East Asia, I can get through. If it gets to be too long, I'm going to stop and make a shorter finishing video on the last parts that we're not going to get through here. The environment, river flooding and dams and pollution are major concerns in China. The Yangtze River is one of the most important features of East Asia. It's the third largest by volume in the world. I never realized that. And it's a big focal point of environmental controversy. It effectively divides China into northern and southern areas. They built this dam, and it's the largest hydroelectric dam in the world. It was completed at a cost of $22.5 billion in 2009. And the gorge is gone now, and it displaced 1.2 million people. And it disrupted the habitat of this dolphin. The World Bank withdrew support from it, but it didn't matter. The Chinese completed it with their own resources, and it generates only about 3% of their electric power. Most of their electric power is generated by coal-burning plants, which creates severe air pollution, especially in the winter. They created this dam because historically flooding has been a huge problem because of what they were doing under the communist regime in the 50s and 60s. And areas that were under cultivation previously helped to maintain water levels downstream, and those areas downstream are subject to periodic flooding. And they're hoping that that dam will stop that problem. The Yellow River historically has been flooding for centuries, despite numerous attempts to control floods. It carries a huge sediment load, which makes it the world's muddiest river, and the sediment accumulates, and then periodically the river breaks free, and it makes a new course change. This has happened 26 times historically that they've been able to determine. And through this Yellow River and its processes, eventually the North China Plain was developed, and that's home to a population almost the size of the United States. They try to control the flooding of China's Sorrow, but sometimes these dikes rise so high that they overflow and more flooding takes place. And there hasn't been a course change since the 30s. Is it due to change again? Erosion on the Loess Plain. Loess is a geographic term. It was deposited by the last ice age, and it's several hundred feet high in some areas, and it was deposited on the North China Plain, and because of that, that's why so much of the population settled there, because it could be fertile soil, but it's easily washed away. Centuries of clearing lands, and we know what that does. It loosens up the soil, right? Deforestation is a problem almost everywhere in the world, and eventually the land erodes, and then the arable land is greatly reduced. And this plateau is one of the poorest regions in China today. Industrialization has created increased water pollution and toxic waste dumping, and increased use of automobiles by the increasing middle class has created some of the worst air pollution in the world. And these are dated terms now, but the problem still exists, as it does from polluted drinking water. And this was an article in the local paper a few years back detailing the problem with smog in many parts of China proper. Japan has a clean environment except for the Fukushima nuclear disaster area. They've resorted to exporting their pollution. Many of their factories are gone. They still control them, but they're located in other parts of Southeast Asia. They've had problems with earthquakes because it is located at the intersection of three tectonic plates. Earthquakes trigger tsunamis or huge tidal waves. And in the far north, because they're at the same latitudinal zone as North America, they have great snowfall, which sometimes results in avalanches. Endangered species. Many forms of traditional Chinese medicine are based on products derived from rare and exotic species. And because of their wealth, They are able to get some of these creatures from other parts of the world, like Africa. They've been trying to protect some high-altitude forests in the bamboo thickets of Sichuan, which is the home of the panda bear, the Siberian tiger, and areas of Yunnan are now protected. The DMZ in South Korea is home to the black bear now because there's no human life in the border between North and South Korea. That's a rather interesting phenomenon. Population. China has one of the world's oldest urban traditions, dating back 3,500 years. Edo had a population over 1 million people in the early 1700s. But in the rest of these areas or regions of China and Japan, it's only been since the end of World War II that some of these cities really began to develop. As I mentioned, China proper refers to the eastern half of the country where 95% of the population resides today. Another demographic policy was the one-child policy under the communist regime as an attempt to control the population. Fertility has been lowered to 1.6. But because of the one-child policy, there's been an imbalance. There are far more boys than girls. And sometimes healthy girls are abandoned at birth because of the patriarchy. They are seeking to have a male son. And these are some of the characteristics of the buildings in the different cities. If you're interested in that, you can read through that at another time. Central place theory. There is a regularly, uniformly spaced larger cities surrounded by constellations of smaller cities. Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Chongqing. Hong Kong is now back to the mainland since 1997 after the British lease finally ran out, a consequence of the opium wars of the early 19th century. Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Canton, all of these are areas of huge urban population. Despite this, China remains predominantly a rural society. Again, most of the population resides in China proper. South Korea and Taiwan are noted for their pronounced urban primacy. That is a population, this is another geographic term, a population concentrated in a single city. And Japan is noted for a new phenomena called superconurbation, or the megapolis, which we have seen in other regions of the world. The Korean landscape can be described as mountains interspersed with alluvial basins on a peninsula. Taipei is a huge city with at least that population. Again, these are dated numbers. The culture, Confucianism was a huge influence on China and Korea, not so much Japan. Ideographic writing is big in all of East Asia. Buddhism became a huge influence in Japan, not so much in China. And it's an influence in Korea as well. And finally, the language and ethnic diversity. Whereas writing systems elsewhere in the world are based on alphabets, East Asia developed a different system. It's based on ideographic writing, where each symbol primarily represents an idea rather than a sound. Ideographic writing requires a large number of symbols. And this style of writing dates back 3,200 years to the dawn of Chinese civilization. It was spread by trade. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam all use the same system. Korea and Vietnam later replaced with alphabetic systems. The advantage of this: two literate people can communicate with written symbols. The disadvantage: it's very difficult to learn. Intense memorization is required. but the writing system allowed for the unification of the entire country. In the 1400s, Korean officials decided that they needed their own alphabet, and they hoped for the development of a more distinct Korean culture apart from the Chinese. Today, only scholarly writings use Chinese characters. In Japan, the writing system is very complex with all of these different characters. Again, take a moment to look through them if you're interested. You can write Japanese with the Roman alphabet, and it's called that style of writing. And the computer technology actually uses Romanji. Confucius was the premier philosopher of Chinese history. He is attempting to create order out of the chaos of those times. While not denying the existence of a supreme being, God is not emphasized. It's more of an ethical guide. Respect authority. The family is the bedrock of society. Proper behavior within the family, which is patriarchy again, this creates a harmonious world with no need for any further rules. It's very lovely in that regard. And do not do unto others that which you would not want done unto you. It's a double negative, similar to the golden rule of Christianity, which says that you should do unto others that which you would want done unto you. It's very similar, only a double negative. Do not do unto others that which you would not want done unto yourself. Christianity, do unto others that which you would want done unto you. Higher education is very important. Historically, the civil service exam, which was dominated by the wealthy because they're the only ones that could afford the education to study to pass the exam, which was basically based on Confucian principles written down by Confucian students and then passed on through the generations. And it was never very important in Japan. They reject the notion of the mandate of heaven. What they do embrace is that the emperor derives his authority from the cosmic harmony. The Japanese emperor represents the sanctity of the family because they've all been descended from this sun god. But the emperor hasn't had any real power since World War II. In the early 1900s, it was blamed for the backwardness of Chinese and the Korean economies, and they attempted to move away from those ethical guidelines. But in the last 40 years, because of the economic growth, they have attempted to re-infuse some ideas of Confucianist ethical behavior, since the Communist Party has been lessened in its authority. There is a revival of this moral philosophy today. Buddhism was also a big influence, Mahayana Buddhism, and it's distinct from what is practiced in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, which is more Theravada. Mahayana is more important in Korea and Japan. It's more of a philosophy, whereas this is more of a devotional or help you with your daily life. They're also considered to be Taoists. Shinto is a big influence in Japan. It's closely related to Japanese nationalism historically. And the militarists developed that into a cult. And they removed that after World War II. Today, it's more a nature-centered religion. Taoism stresses spiritual harmony, and it's directly associated with Feng Shui or geomancy. Christianity is big in South Korea, but generally speaking, there are also Muslims in the West, in China. And in Japan and South Korea, they are usually temporary contract workers. Generally speaking, this is one of the most secular, non-religious places on earth. There are many cults in Japan. Kim Jong-un tries to promote the ideology of self-reliance, which means devotion to his absolute authority. Finally, language. Japanese is not related to any other languages, yet Korean and Japanese languages share many grammatical features. Japan is one of the world's most homogeneous groups, as are the Koreans. 20,000 Brazilians of Japanese ancestry have returned to work for the high wages paid in the country. Japan sent many people to work in that region in the 20th century. They're going to have a need for more workers because they have zero population, almost negative growth. There are many Thai and Filipino women that are contract workers. And finally, here are some other dialects. If you're interested, take a look through these different distinct dialects in China. There are some other ones. Taiwan, they speak more Austronesian languages. And since the arrival of the Kuomintang, there are Mandarin speakers, and they have conflicts with the indigenous Taiwanese. And their local culture has been growing in this century. And for business, English has emerged as an important language of business meetings, as a way of trying to get around all of these different dialects. And that concludes the first 3 questions of East Asia.